Hello fans, this is the grandson of the Apollo moon hoax theory. Before I begin today's episode, there is one tiny mistake that I would like to correct from my previous video. It's fair to say that Project Black Box was quite devastating to the reflected light excuses that propagandists use. But it seems they found a way to dodge the whole issue of my video. The same old game of clinging to one brief and honest mistake that I made, in this case regarding decibels.
It would be as if your neighbor's kids are practicing with their electric guitars and the noise is bothering you. Then they make the argument that you shouldn't be able to hear it because their amps are only set to 70 decibels and according to their estimates, the noise is all in your mind.
This is by far the most utterly ridiculous analogy I have ever heard. 70 decibels is nearly half the noise level produced by jet engines. So that is quite undeniably loud. This was a bit of an oversight on my part. As a number of propagandists have correctly pointed out, decibels are an exponential scale, and I simply cannot halve a decibel value to determine half its sound intensity. But looking into the subject, I learned that our ears register loudness roughly in accordance with the decibel value of sound pressure, and calculating half the loudness is simply a matter of halving the decibel value. So, as luck would have it, my original statement was, in that sense, correct all along. Not that this has anything to do with albedos, shutter speeds, aperture settings, or any of the other valid points that I brought up in my video, but it seems to be the only fault that my opponents can find. Poor propagandists. Jay Windley once told me that correcting one's mistake is what makes one credible. But if I remove this segment from public view and replace it with a revised and corrected version, I risk getting accused of cover-up. So I decided to rectify my honest mistake here in this video. Propagandists love to go over their enemies' videos with a fine-tooth comb for any tiny mistake that they can cling to and use for defamatory purposes. And at the same time, they ignore all the mistakes that they've made. For example, in one of his YouTube videos, Phil Plait made the mistake of stating that Mu Cephei was the farthest visible star in the southern hemisphere. He later corrected this mistake in his very next video.
Well, before I get to this week's episode, I have to admit I made an error in last week's episode. I said that Mu Cephei, at a distance of between 2 and 5,000 light years, was the most distant star you can see with the naked eye. Well, that's wrong. In fact, the most distant star you can see with the naked eye is Eta Caridae, which is about 7,500 light years away. And, well, you know, I blew it. I made a mistake, and that happens. But this one's a little more embarrassing than usual because, in fact, I studied Eta Car for a little while using Hubble. So I'm a little embarrassed by this one. But I'm also a little ticked because nobody from the Southern Hemisphere emailed me and told me I'd made a mistake. So look, folks, if you catch me in an error here, email me. If you're right, I'll, may use it on the video. Or I may simply ignore it. We'll see.
Now, I could just as easily take that mistake of Plait's and hold it against him saying, "Oh look, the bad astronomer doesn't know which is the most distant star, despite studying that very star." But I don't, because everyone makes mistakes, and clinging to people's corrected mistakes for defamatory purposes are purely the tactics of propagandists and internet trolls with axes to grind and no real evidence against their opponent's message. That being said, enjoy the show. It's going to be, dare I say it, a blast. In less than 3 minutes after stepping onto the surface of the moon, Neil Armstrong made this damning observation.
The descent engine did not leave a crater of any size. It has about 1 foot clearance on the ground. We're essentially on a very level place here. I can see some evidence of rays emanating from the descent engine, but very insignificant amount.
Armstrong's statements are indeed confirmed in the photos that he allegedly took. In not one of them is there evidence of a blast crater beneath the lunar module. And not just on Apollo 11. All moon landings lacked evidence of a blast crater beneath the lunar module. Bill Casing, the former head of technical publications at Rocketdyne, noticed this oddity whilst looking through thousands of NASA photographs, and it became one of his primary arguments.
The lunar lander engine developed 10,000 pounds of thrust, and I've seen many, many rocket engines of that capability in action, and they are so powerful they will move giant rocks across the canyon. A 10,000-pound thrust engine would have dug a hole right down to bedrock, and it would have stirred up an enormous cloud of dust, and that never appeared in any of the so-called films that they took of the lunar lander. So the crater, the absence of the crater in any photograph of Apollo lunar landers is actually probably the only real proof that you need.
In 2002, whilst trying to prove that the Apollo landings were real, Aaron Rainan of Third Wave Media interviewed veteran astronaut and card trick champion Gene Cernan. Cernan, who served as the command pilot on Apollo 17, is globally known as the last man on the moon.
I asked Gene why there was no crater under the lunar lander.
Thank God there's not a crater there. We might be in it because we shut the engine down some 3 meters above the surface. And we literally free fell that last 9 or 10 feet. And the reason we did that, if we kept the engine running all the way down to the surface, it truly would have dug a crater. The back pressure would have blown back up in the engine and probably blown us off the moon.
Did Neil Armstrong use the same techniques when landing?
Absolutely.
However, this was not how Neil Armstrong landed his spacecraft on Apollo 11. Instead, as revealed in the official NASA footage, the Eagle's descent engine was still running when the footpads touched the surface, and it remained running for a good 5 seconds afterwards.
Hey. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. APA at a descent. Mode control both on.
By Gene Cernan's admission, this would have been enough to bury the Eagle deep in its own blast crater. This is exactly what Bill Casing had been saying all along.
This enormously powerful jet of flame and heat and gas, it would have easily scooped up an enormous crater. In fact, there was supposition that the crater would have been so big that the lunar lander would have disappeared into it. That's true.
Yet in spite of what Casing and Cernan have told us, there is no evidence of a blast crater under the LEM. Interestingly, in the October 1997 issue of Ralph magazine, Darren Osborne, the then press officer for the Canberra Deep Space Centre, was interviewed to provide refuting evidence against the Apollo conspiracy claims. But towards the end, he states, "You've got me stumped about why there is no crater under the lunar module. That's got me kinda worried." Over the course of 2006, I repeatedly tried to get in touch with Mr. Osborne, but the contact details I was given directed me to Glenn Nagel.
You call Glenn Nagel at the Canberra Deep Space Communication Complex. I'm unable to take your call at this time. If you would like to leave a message, please do so after the tone. I'll get back to you as soon as possible.
I left countless messages on his answering machine requesting the correct contact details, but my calls were never returned. Bill Casing was featured on the Fox special dealing with the moon landing conspiracy, and had this to say about another problem this engine would have caused.
If they had truly landed on the moon, this dust would have then descended on the lunar lander, on the footpads, and we find not a trace of dust on the footpads. When I discovered that alone, I said, no way am I looking at a lunar lander that landed on the moon.
And you don't have to take Bill Casing's word for it. Astrophysicist Dr. Thomas Gold, a member of NASA's own Surveyor project, voiced grave concern about the dust the LEM's engine would stir up just days before the launch of Apollo 11.